Welcome everyone to this event in the What's Next in Foreign Affairs Speakers Series. My name is Alyssa Ayres and I'm Dean of the Elliott School. And today we are focusing on the role that subnational and local actors like city governments are increasingly playing in international affairs. And we're delighted to be able to learn directly from the mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti, who has been among the most internationally active of our big city mayors in the United States. This is, of course, a moment when we're seeing cities take on much more dynamic international outreach, forging partnerships, not only with individual counterpart cities elsewhere in the world, pursuing trade promotion, investment for their local economies, but also becoming more deeply enmeshed in new networks of cities that are pursuing similar goals. Cities are the site of implementation for things like sustainable development, the place where the relationship between elected official and citizen is daily and direct, but they weren't always traditionally part of the international diplomatic dialogue. And that is what's changing with the rise of city networks that are active on matters like climate change, the sustainable development goals, homeland security, and so many others. Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti is uniquely able to share with us his perspective as a leader in global city engagement, someone who has spoken often about and helped realize the vision of Los Angeles as a city on the global stage, in his words. Let me give you his brief bio before we begin. Mayor Garcetti is a fourth-generation Angeleno and the 42nd mayor of Los Angeles. Born and raised in the San Fernando Valley, the son of public servants and the grandson and great-grandson of immigrants from Mexico and Eastern Europe, Mayor Garcetti's life has been shaped by a deep commitment to the core values of justice, dignity, and equality for all people. His leadership is making an impact on the national and international stages. He rallied more than 400 mayors in cities across America to adopt the Paris Climate Agreement after the Trump administration pulled out of the pact. And he successfully led the bid to bring the 2028 Summer Olympics and Paralympic Games to the United States for the first time in more than 30 years. He has lived and worked in Europe, Asia, and Africa, and appointed Los Angeles's first deputy mayor for international affairs to expand LA's global ties and bring more jobs, economic opportunity, culture, education, and visitors to the city. So why don't we just go ahead and begin our conversation. Mayor Garcetti, you have been a champion for the concept of global cities, for cities to be on the global stage, as you said, at the Pacific Council. Can you share with us your sense of the top 3 or 4 international priorities for Los Angeles and how those have emerged in recent years? I ask that because a huge city, a mega city, has many international priorities, but it would be interesting to know just what has come to the top.
Great. Well, thank you, Dean Ayres. What a treat it is to talk to you and to everybody that is participating here today. Thank you, everybody, for taking your time out of your day. An area that kind of merges for me, the 2 strands of my life that really have never been 2 strands of my life, international and foreign affairs work and local governance, because to me, they've been one and the same. I grew up in a city where you can see the face of the world on the streets of Los Angeles, and vice versa. Whenever I left Los Angeles as a youth, as a professor, as an activist, I would always see the face of Los Angeles on the streets of the world. So I think that we very much would have to create a Los Angeles if one didn't exist. It's kind of at this intersection of North America, Latin America, and the Pacific Rim. The most dynamic kind of intersection, arguably, in the world. And everything we do depends on those global ties. I think it's an irony that maybe, or a contradiction, that we live in an era in which borders have never been stronger, and also where borders have never been weaker. And I mean that, the nation state isn't going anywhere. We see wars being fought over these sorts of borders. We see the enforcement of that and the technology that has made that borders are here for a long time to stay. But if you look at the problems that we confront, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's climate change, whether it's looking at our global economy, we have never been more closely tied to each other. So I always joke that in Los Angeles, we're border crossers. Some of us, that's our individual histories or our family's histories. But metaphorically, it's really what Los Angeles looks at. And I would say for us, if I had to pick 3 largest issues that we face, really are in very large buckets in climate and climate change, in our interconnected economy. And then I would put in a 3rd category, really our justice and anti-poverty work, which a lot of people think of as something intensely local. But for me, whether it's an immigrant coming from Latin America to Southern California and Los Angeles, whether it's the opportunities for those who grow up poor in a city like Los Angeles and other ones across the United States without the opportunities to link to globalism and globalization. Those would be the three areas I think that are most important to us, even as we engage on becoming one of the great global cities of the world, now the third largest global metropolitan economy after Tokyo and basically tied with New York. LA is almost the same size as New York. So it's a huge responsibility, but also a huge opportunity for us too.
Can I just ask you to follow up? So you listed climate really as your top priority among these three. Can you speak a little bit about how, was it always the case, or did you have a growing realization that climate was just absolutely crucial for the city itself to take on?
I think I've always felt that way for the world as an Angelino. Increasingly, as mayor and as a local leader, I've seen that for a long time. We recently opened up the largest wind farm in North American, maybe global history outside of China. We're not even sure inside China. This was 3 weeks ago, and I was thinking now that we own our own municipal utility. It's the largest in the country. We generate our own electricity. We are now at 61% carbon-free electricity generation. When I started as a city council member in 2001, we were at 2% renewables, 2%. And so I think we've all come a long way, and things are accelerating even more. But whether it's the fires that we see, the drought that we're living in, the heat that causes people to die in my city, I think the urgency of this moment isn't unique just to Los Angeles. Our world faces the biggest challenge of our lifetimes and maybe in human history with climate change. So I don't see that in any way retreating. And yes, I do think it has grown greatly since I've been mayor.
So related to that, can you talk a little bit about your engagement with, and in fact, your leadership within the C40 Cities Network? There's a focus on climate, but in mobilizing cities around the world to be engaged on climate change questions, responding to the imperatives. It's also a kind of a technology transfer, or like a knowledge sharing among cities. Can you talk about what it's like to first be part of this network and then be a leader among the network?
Sure. So C40, it's a funny name, right? Because it's more than 40 cities. It's now 97 cities that are the largest cities essentially of the world. A quarter of the world's GDP is contained in those metro areas that these cities represent. And it was started initially to be kind of a counterpart to the G20. So initially it was C20, and then we realized in countries like the United States, Washington being the only representative wouldn't capture the big metropolitan areas. So it's grown to nearly 100 cities. And I was the most recent chair of that for the last 2 years. It is an extraordinary network, Dean, not only for the work on climate change, but I hope we can return to it just as a network of subnational leaders, period. It's really the only big association of the big city mayors of the world. It just happens to be we get together on climate change, but we develop personal relationships that I'd love to speak about, and how that impacts how we lead and how we push these issues forward. But C40 itself, mayors are competitive in a good way. And I say, good mayors, what's the old expression? Good mayors steal, good mayors borrow, great mayors steal. So whenever we get together and you hear like, oh, in Bogota, they've got 1,000 electric buses already. You go back home, you go to your, Department of Transportation and say, why is it taking us so long to get our electric buses? Bogota isn't richer than us. We're Los Angeles, or Shenzhen has already done it with all of its taxis and all of its buses. In Buenos Aires, they're talking about the 15-minute city, 15 minutes to walk, to work, to play, to your home, and obviously to any of the places you need your basics. Something very different than the way a lot of American cities were planned, where we get into cars, like in Los Angeles, to go everywhere and pollute and commute. So we immediately want to plan the way Buenos Aires is doing that, and so on and so forth. Secondly, collectively, we become a force as big and bigger than most nation states. So for instance, at the Glasgow Climate Summit, I was there representing as chair and was one of 3 people allowed in those first 2 days to speak from the main stage who wasn't a national leader. And as national leaders got up and gave their pledges for Brazil, and gave their pledge for New Zealand, and their pledge for Kazakhstan, I was asked to go up there and give the city's pledge. And we had gone way beyond our 97 cities. I'd set a goal of 1,000. We got to 1,049 cities that the UN then calculated for us was the equivalent of the 4th to 5th largest emitter at the national level in the world, who were zeroing out our carbon emissions with our pledge. And unlike the countries of the world, only one which was ahead of its Paris timeline, the Gambia, over 2/3 of our 97 core cities are already there or ahead of our timelines. So we did that not to shame countries, but to inspire them and to say we are the countries. We come from each one of these places, and if we can do it, so too can you. So it's really, C40 to me is emblematic about how quickly local government can act, but it's not just about local stuff. We're acting in the global interest and certainly in our national interest. So we're there to kind of be those laboratories, but more than laboratories, because that implies we just experiment, we're the factory floors of the change that needs to happen.
I mean, this is one of the most interesting things happening, to me, at least in the international arena, the way that so many cities are stepping up and being voluntarily taking on commitments, although there is not an obligation at the city level, right? The obligation is at the nation state level, but cities are taking this on for themselves. And C40 has this engagement model. We're seeing other models of city networks like the Strong Cities Network, the network of cities that are engaged on the sustainable development goals. Can you share a little bit more about LA and Los Angeles's relationship to the city networks and how you approach these, their diplomatic formats of their own?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've tried to be the co-authors and co-participants and wherever we can to be the leaders of these international networks. I saw that in a very selfish way as something good for Los Angeles, not about political credit, really about policy change and implementation. And the more that we could educate our own people about the importance of this, the better and more accelerated our work could be. So there's Change, a group that we started on gender equity, the first gender equity global subnational organization that we founded with the mayors of London and Tokyo and Mexico City, of Freetown and Sierra Leone, and a couple other cities to really look at what we could do around our gender equity work. We were the first city in the United States to publish and track all of our SDGs, something that still most Americans don't know about, but most global citizens do. Maybe it's because of our tradition of not only hosting the UN, but often being hostile to the UN in the kind of more grassroots politics of the United States, that, if the UN's telling us to do something, it must be bad. But when we look at these and say, no, housing goals are good for housing people who are homeless in Los Angeles. Gender equity goals are good for our daughters and our residents. If you look at environmental goals, this is about the air we breathe. And so we've been a part of that and really trying to daylight that to keep ourselves accountable and inspire others to do the same. And then we've been part of groups like the Mayor's Migration Council to look at global migration, the 100 Resilient Cities, which helped us write what was the strongest resilient city plan in the nation, if not the world, and do things like get ready for earthquakes before they happen and climate change as it's occurring. So we've loved these networks from C40 to Mayor's Migration Council. And I think, unfortunately, if I can just speak bluntly, a lot of mayors think, my constituents are going to think I'm dabbling in things that are over there instead of taking care of the things that are right here. This is about travel or junkets or somebody's just interested in foreign relations. I would say to any mayor, even if your background is not in foreign policy, you need to get involved and engaged in this. Your people demand it. It accelerates how quickly you can do things. And just the sheer force of ideas that come in will inform you better as a leader and help us realize that our work is together so that we can get national governments to step up as aggressively as we are locally.
How has that changed the way your international affairs office functions? I mean, I can imagine maybe 15 years ago, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I can imagine before the advent of these networks that have allowed cities to band together and share this kind of information and share what you're doing together to tackle these global challenges. The international component for a city might have been focused on trade promotion issues, perhaps higher education, and perhaps some of the consular work. In a big city, you're going to have a lot of consulates. But this is adding a different dimension to that kind of work. So can you talk about what that is like on a daily basis? Do you have a kind of a regular schedule of international engagements? Does it look like a diplomatic calendar?
Well, I don't know yet, because hopefully soon I'll be looking at what a diplomatic calendar is like. But I don't have anything to compare it to, but I'll describe how it's more not its own section, but it's integrated into almost everything we do. So a couple examples. We went, on my first day as mayor, I went to Pava Street in the San Fernando Valley, part of LA that you mentioned I grew up in. I wanted us to get back to the basics of taking care of what city government should do. But then the second thing I did, as I came back here to City Hall, sat down at my desk, And I signed a letter to the US Olympic Committee saying we wanted to host the Olympics. Now, LA has bid for the Olympics more than any city in the world. We've hosted it twice. We'll be one of 3 cities with London and Paris to host for a 3rd time when it comes in 2028. And I did it because I realized in 1984, when I was a kid growing up and I saw the Olympics here, what it meant to have the world in my city, what it meant to elevate who we were, our ambition, our generosity with each other, the way we volunteered to help folks from other countries navigate this great city. I saw that during the Special Olympics, which we got to host my 2nd year here, where communities would host the Special Olympic delegations from other countries, and a neighborhood would essentially adopt that country. And it really was a 2-way learning that happens. And we're already such a global city. So we have a deputy mayor, first, I think the only one in the United States, and maybe one of the first, if not the first, Ambassador Nina Hachigian, who's an old friend, or I should say longtime friend, because we're both still young. And we have really had a vision that we've shared for a long time of how important the subnational level is. Her team, and you're right, 15 years ago, it was receive the invitations, do a lot of meetings with a governor from Guanajuato or a mayor who's coming in from Shenzhen or whatever it is, and kind of take the passive sister city relations, which can be great platforms, but are only as strong as you make them, trade missions, so trade, tourism, and investment, but not really the more robust agenda. So I would say, instead of this being like, oh, there's a diplomatic calendar or there's just foreign policy stuff that we're doing, it's really integrated into the lifeblood of almost everything we do. If we're paving streets now with a lighter color to deal with the heat island effect that climate change has brought, we have people calling from around the world saying, how can I get that whiter asphalt? And can we co-bid on things so that we can get the price down of this globally? If I'm looking at a community college student and she's never left the city, let alone the state or the country, but we can connect her with our mayor's youth ambassador program, and she gets to go to Egypt or Japan or Mexico for the first time in her life, that changes her life fundamentally, strengthens our economy and her opportunities. So it really is, I would advise folks who are looking at this, don't just segregate off your foreign policy or your international work to an office that lives on its own. Make sure that office is making sure that everybody else co-owns that, understands that, is fluent in that, and is kind of pushing and pulling those forces back and forth.
Let me ask you just a couple more questions, and then we'll open this up to Q&A. And just a reminder for everyone, we'll be taking questions through the Q&A function on Zoom. In your sense, having led LA all these years, and before that you were on the city council, so you've been part of LA's governance for a long time. What does it take for a city to be a global city, a city on the global stage?
It's funny, I brought up the Olympics, and I kind of use the times we've hosted the Olympics as these measuring posts. I think we ironically bid for the 1924 Olympics and lost. And it was suddenly a few years later, when the Great Depression hit, nobody wanted the Olympics, that the Olympic Committee said, what was that place near Hollywood out in the United States? Why don't we give it to them? And so in 1932, it was kind of our coming out to the world that we were a global city. 1984, Cold War going on, Olympic boycotts, our Olympics were bankrupt in the United States, and the whole movement was kind of moribund. We were able to bring great American kind of entrepreneurship in this new model that saved the Olympics. And I would say that was kind of our coming out as a great global city. The way I think about Los Angeles now and in time for the 2028 Olympics and Paralympic Games is that it's our moment to shine as kind of an indispensable global city. One of those really critically necessary cities. And we're not very good in Los Angeles at thinking about ourselves that way. When I tell people we're the 3rd largest municipal economy of any city in the world, they don't believe me. And then I have to show them kind of the evidence that it's true, that there's 19 million people, that we're leaders, we're the manufacturing capital of America, obviously the entertainment capital of America, the aerospace capital, all of these things that you put together, you have to tell your story. And I think, globally, that's a really important thing. I've always said, leaders are narrators, and we're never taught how to be good storytellers and good narrators. But whether it's traveling your city and pulling together the person who's unhoused and the billionaire and figuring out how they relate to each other and what we have in common, what our ambitions are and how our destinies are tied together, or whether it's our place in the world, every city needs to kind of define its flavor. And it doesn't have to be just one strong single flavor, but maybe the better metaphor is like what dish you are. And here in Los Angeles, I think we're really about 3 things: freedom. I think we're about, creativity. And I also believe we're about belonging. which to me is the strongest of all three of those words, one that I wish America would embrace more, because so many Americans don't feel like they belong anymore. And we don't have a sense of pushing a national identity of a place where we all belong. Not that we share the same culture necessarily, but that we have a sense much stronger than diversity or inclusion, that we have co-ownership and that we belong here. And that's really what we've tried to promote in Los Angeles, that you can come from here and belong, but you can visit here and in your first hour in LA, you feel you belong too.
We are a school of international affairs, the Elliott School, and our motto is training leaders for the world. So what would you say to students who are thinking about working in a city government, but on the international side? What would you suggest that they study up and learn about to better prepare them?
Well, one, I would say do it. Be part of this movement, which I think will only grow. I think our State Department increasingly realizes that. And in fairness, most other countries are way ahead of us. You go to whenever I visit mayors' offices around the world, they have a much better established and embedded international affairs office than most American cities do. But I would say the things to study are, well, twofold. One is understand globalization, the global flows of trade, of tourism, of international students studying abroad. I would understand the important SDG goals that we have and climate change, look at things like gender, racial equity, understand those in a global context. But the second thing I would say, and I always say this to young people interested in politics, period, is don't fetishize that national level. Really embed yourself at a local level and put down roots. In other words, your conversations at the global level are only as strong as your local roots. If you know a block, or you know a street, or you know a neighborhood, or even if you can try to figure out a city, and a city is a pretty complicated place, you're going to speak with the specificity and authority that so often we lack when we get to the highest level conversations that we have. Journalism does a good job of this, right? They tell the stories of what it's like for people on the ground in Ukraine so we can understand it at a human level. But so too can local government. It can translate the humanity of this work, the importance of what this means person to person. And so I would just say, don't think that you're going to come to a city and just get to deal with that national or kind of even sexier international level, which we all like and gravitate towards. The best international affairs kind of tutorial I've ever gotten is being a local elected official. And I know that sounds like a contradiction, but it's not. It truly makes me much more informed, much more powerful on a global stage, because I can refer to a huge collection of human beings who just happen to live here in Los Angeles, but who are tied to those global forces and global challenges.
Let me go to some of the questions that have come in. Here's a question from one of our faculty members, Nina Kelsey, whose research is actually on environmental politics and subnational and international engagement. Her question is, it's so great to see you here, Mayor Garcetti. I would love to hear more about what you see as the obstacles internally and externally to municipalities doing deep climate mitigation work like LA is doing. Do you think there were turning points where LA could have been diverted from its focus on climate mitigation policy? Do you have a sense of why some municipalities go deep on climate mitigation policy and others don't?
That's a wonderful question and really an important one. Thank you, Nina, for that. I think a few things. I mean, it's politics, right? So politics, there's a million diversions. With climate specifically, it can come from either direction. I mean, we've had, for instance, on some of our building decarbonization work, recently, some labor unions who understandably are worried that we're not going to put natural gas through pipes, for instance, that will go into homes, and will they lose jobs? So they work in an oil refinery, and what does that mean for non-college educated, good middle-class jobs that are in short supply in our country? They can come from folks saying, you're not going fast enough, but can't wait for the science to figure it out. And sometimes they're saying, just do things that then result in real failures, and not failing forward where we learn, but just failures. And then, of course, you have, I think, in other parts of the country where it's become more politicized, people do see this as more one party's impulse than others. I'm reassured, though, that when I founded Climate Mayors, which was the US kind of equivalent of the C40, when President Trump said that he was going to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accords, instead of crying in a corner, we picked up the phone. And by the end of about 3 or 4 months of work, we had over 300 cities led by Republican, Democratic, and independent mayors who all said, if he's out, we're in. In some ways, I joke that if we had had a Democratic president who was staying in Paris, we might have done less work than having the enemy who was saying we're going to be withdrawing from this climate accord, the only country in the world to consider that. But yeah, there were moments all the time when I referred to Dean Ayres, that when I was a junior council member, 30 years old, my first year, and we were renewing a contract for a coal plant in southwest of the United States, because our lines kind of connect throughout the West. So our Department of Water and Power owned it, was going to get it going. And I said, I don't think we should be reinvesting in a coal plant. That was in 2001. And kind of our equivalent of a city manager laughed at me, patted me on the head, said, "You're cute. You're going to get, your one vote, maybe two." And I went to now Senator Alex Padilla, who was serving with me, and got my second vote. And then we both split up. By the end, we had a 10-5, because there's 15 members of the council, vote against this coal plant and divesting from it. So I think you're right to ask. There are these moments in which people do need to display courage. It might be now looking at hydrogen, which gets, green hydrogen gets criticism from both ways. Some who say, oh, this is greenwashing, others who are saying, let's stick with oil and gas. But everything is worth trying. Everything is worth the courage of putting that forward and seeing if it works, because the urgency of this moment demands it. And I think the last thing I'd say is I hope that we can continue to depoliticize this so that it isn't seen as something partisan in the United States. And there's great leaders who are Republican mayors who I think are doing great work, like Mayor Suarez in Miami, to prove that this is not a Democratic issue.
Here's a question from Max Boucher. How are you viewing the role? Let me expand based on some of the comments you made earlier about the State Department's role, recognizing the importance of subnational actors in international affairs. How do you see the role of U.S. ambassadors and missions abroad in supporting the international engagement of U.S. subnational actors?
It's growing, but still needs to be much more robust. And I'm pleased to see this administration putting a focus on that. And I think we should have an ambassador at large and supported legislation to create that. At least we have to have a leader in the State Department that really doesn't just passively take in all the subnational requests that come to our country, but can also strategize about how best to put American leadership squarely at the forefront of those global convenings that are happening around the issues that we're talking about. I think that's critically important for America's success. I think it's critically important for world peace. It's critically important for moments of danger. I mean, C40, when I was alluding to the fact that this is an amazing network, when this is probably our 10,000th Zoom each, but when I was on I think my second or third Zoom ever, it was when I hit the bat signal and I asked for all the mayors that were part of C40 to get on a call to talk about this new, novel coronavirus. And across all the time zones, we got about 45 mayors, and I know how busy each one of them is, trust me, that got on this phone call. And we had the mayor of Seoul talking to us about what drive-through testing was. Nobody knew what that even meant. We had the mayor of Milan, because that was the hotspot of the world, talking about how you could begin to prepare your hospitals so that fewer people would die in the hallways. We immediately the next day set about implementing the world's defense in our cities against COVID. When I talked to my successor at C40, Mayor Khan, he shared a story with me recently of being with his Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, and telling him about that call. And Boris Johnson turned to one of his ministers and said, do we know all this stuff, drive-through testing, this, that, the other? And they said, yes, but we're waiting to prepare the reports and get it up to you. And then we're going to present that to you, and then you can talk to world leaders about it. And we both realized that it takes months for nations to figure things out, let alone to then do the global diplomacy of negotiating with each other. Mayors are able to cut across those borders again and do it the next day. So I do think that it's really important that we build this infrastructure for our nation's national security, our economic prosperity, for a more just world, for a more resilient world. And I'm glad to see some good, strong steps so far. We can go a lot further.
Got a question here from another of our faculty members, Professor David Rain, who is also the chair of the geography department here at George Washington University. He says, thank you, Mr. Mayor, for participating. This is a governance question. As I'm sure you know, Mayor in a lot of cities is more of a ceremonial position than one with real power. How can this be remedied so we can have more cities around the globe that are like Bogota or Los Angeles?
I think increasingly cities need to have, chief executives, and almost, I would say 9 out of 10 cities in the world kind of recognize that. In a lot of places, yeah, you will have a chief minister, or maybe the state leadership is the most important, but essentially they're working still that subnational level, no matter what title we give to them. But remember, this isn't just about leaders. This is about the connection of those shot callers at the departmental level. We've talked about urbanization in India, for instance, this great urbanization that's happening. And we've been plugged in, whether it's on ports or sanitation systems, looking at transportation and public transportation networks, that there's a common language that leaders, yes, need to be engaged with, but they usually then pass it off to folks who are the implementers. And so even where we don't have traditional mayors, you can find with just a little bit of sleuthing who that person is, who she is that leads the sanitation department in Freetown, and get them connected with the person who does the same thing in your own city, and figure out if there's work that we can do together. And don't get me wrong, it's tougher in different systems. The Chinese system has mayors, but then there's always a party secretary who's a step above, who's not a day-to-day chief executive, but the more political and party authority. In India, it's very confusing, obviously, because of the chief ministers and then the state powers and then all of that. But it's worth navigating. And I always find that you can find people who, if they don't have as much formal power, they have a lot of informal power, and don't play that down too much when people have the bully pulpit or the ability to communicate to constituents, even if it's more ceremonial. And vice versa, you have other people who have a lot of formal power, but not the informal position. Just find who they are, get to them, and build that network. And that's what we did in C40. For a while, our Indian cities had dropped out. We hadn't found the right people, but we were able to, and really build that accountability by working with the chief environmental ministers in those states too, that really were the key players for a lot of the work we were doing.
We've got a really interesting question that's come in about the built environment. And I mean, it gets back to the issue of cities are really where the rubber meets the road. So Constantine Dekulos asks, how does a large city that is already largely built and established go about enacting new sustainable urban planning initiatives like the 15-minute city in Buenos Aires?
Well, Constantine, welcome to my day. Welcome to my life. That is the challenge. Los Angeles is this strange city because we kind of have the dynamism of the developing world and the ambition and the kind of the scale of that, with the wealth and sometimes the entrenchedness of the developed world, so-called. So the global north and global south almost intersect in Los Angeles in a pretty interesting way. We're very much built out. We're always on the cutting edge. Freeways aren't these old-fashioned bad things. They were the cutting edge that worked really well. And it was 20 minutes everywhere. I mean, it was mass transit that was personal, right? Everybody get a car and get there. Now that we've hit the wall and we've gotten too dense and that doesn't work, we had to pass the largest infrastructure package of a local government in American history ×2, where we're saying for the next 40 years, we're going to build 15 new rapid transit lines. No city's ever tried to do that all at once, but certainly not in the modern era in the United States. And that will only be a piece of what we can do. But you get to the heart of, I think, what most local leaders need to be focused on. For me, in Los Angeles, it's really the 3 main issues are housing, housing, and housing. Because transportation, pollution, job readiness, all is that Los Angeles didn't build enough housing for 40, 50 years. I've tripled that pace since I've come in as mayor, but we need to keep that pace going, maybe double it again, and keep that going for 20 years before we will feel that relief of housing being where jobs are and close to these transit lines. So I think you get to a really great point on sustainability, that it really is about good urban planning. And it can't be undone quickly. People who are, why isn't this happening right now? Why didn't that happen in the 2 years you were there? I kind of, I have a concept I call the backwards looking future self. So often we try to govern in the moment because of either the glory that we'll get or responding to the criticism of today or the headlines of tomorrow. And we don't go to our future self 10 years from now and look back at the decision we're making today. And I try to always push my staff, and I always try to preach the gospel of this to other leaders. The decisions we make today are probably that make us the least popular now will be the ones that you're most well remembered for in the future. Michael Bloomberg told me that. And it's really important to have the courage that even when people are saying, I'm stuck in traffic, don't build any more housing. to say, but we actually need more housing if we're going to have a sustainable city, where we're not stuck in traffic, where we aren't having high rates of poverty, where we don't have homelessness, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think it requires both courage and good urban planning to get that built out city on a sustainable path.
Can I just follow up on that question? What are some of the biggest hurdles to building housing? Is it purely financial? Are there land use hurdles? I mean, is it everything all together?
Yes, it is less land, very expensive land. It's well-intentioned policies that usually my side of the ideology and Democrats have said each stone well-intentioned, but now so heavy in a backpack you can barely move. It's higher labor. It's our own NIMBYism more than anything else. But to give you some hope, the way we were able to triple the number of housing units produced per year since I've been mayor was just with a couple planning tools. One of them was the accessory dwelling unit, the artist formerly known as the granny flat, and the other was transit-oriented development, where I as mayor had the power, without the council worrying, my city council worrying about having to do this neighborhood by neighborhood, to say any place that we had a transit corridor, we could double, triple, even more the size of housing as long as people were building affordable housing with it. So we've increased the amount of affordable low-income housing, but also our overall housing. 50% of our housing is now this transit-oriented development, and 25%, which used to be just a few percentage points, are now the accessory dwelling units that people are putting in their own properties. And something which a lot of people fear, and my own city council opposed, but I was in favor of, which our state just recently passed, was a Senate Bill 9, which allows us to take single family zoning. So your home is on a single family lot and cut it in half into two. And then on each of those, put 2 units of housing. So one is now zoned for 4. And some people feel like it's the end of the world. You're going to lose your neighborhood. I always say, at least the city that I walk through, most neighborhoods, that one house you think one family's living in, 2 or 3 are already there. So are we going to plan it and build it more humanely and more with more vision, or are we just going to accept slowly boiling like lobsters and wondering how we got here?
What is the housing conversation like among mayors when you get together in the C40 conversation, for example? I mean, there are housing pressures all over the world, but I would imagine they're not always in the same dimensions.
Yeah, I think most countries are much further advanced than we are, quite frankly. We do have those discussions to some extent, but look at hyper-capitalist cities like Hong Kong and Singapore. They figured out that housing has to be looked at more as a commodity, not as an investment. Because here in the United States, in our cities where we've looked at them as investments, there's a lot of people making a lot of money who, if we're lucky enough to have owned a house or can afford to buy into it, are making a ton of money, but at the expense of people who are living in tents and middle-class jobs that are moving out, and others wondering if their children can stay there. We need to have public housing be something that isn't just what we do for our most low-income Americans, but we have to find models, public-private models like Singapore has done in Hong Kong, where you build these things out with the private sector in a much more dense way, but at a much more affordable level. And then government can also make sure that, yes, you get some return, but somebody doubling their money in 2 or 3 years comes at the expense of your social fabric, of your poverty and justice. Washington, D.C. feels this, Los Angeles feels that. So those discussions are oftentimes more inside the American mayors that I've had than globally, because globally it's just cheaper. It's cheaper to build infrastructure. It's cheaper to build housing. There's better private-public partnership models. There's better public housing. There's better purchases of private housing by large cities, places like Stockholm, where the government will own many of those private apartments and make sure that it stays steady and regulated and safe. Those things kind of, I think, rankle a lot of Americans when we either are pure kind of free marketeers, or we think that libertarianism will get us there. And Los Angeles is a perfect example. We're, yes, now a liberal city, but I always joke we're really just a libertarian city. Find me water, build me freeways, and get out of the way, government. Now we're realizing government has to play some sort of role in making sure where we see 60,000 people in Los Angeles County who are without homes, we have to solve that collectively. And you certainly don't need to be homeless to feel that crunch.
We've got 2 questions that are actually quite similar. One's from a faculty member, and another, I believe, is from one of our students. So let me try to combine these questions, but they're both about what happens when there's tensions between what you'd like to do at the city level versus what are policies in place at the national level. For example, what if there are visa restrictions that prevent international students or visitors from coming to your city? How do you handle conflicts between the city level and the national level due to different visions and priorities?
A great question as well, and not one to easily answer, but I think I've always said there's kind of three levels of power you have as a mayor. You have your constitutional, or in our case, city charter power, our formal power, that I have the largest municipal utility in the United States, the largest port, the busiest port in the hemisphere, third busiest airport in the world, as well as these other things from our libraries to our fire department, these kind of large entities that can address some of these challenges collectively and model them for our national leaders, so that when there is no help from Washington, D.C. on a pandemic, my firefighters, together with a global relief group, CORE, which Ann Lee and Sean Penn had founded to work in places like Haiti, together stood up the largest testing centers in the world and later the largest vaccination centers in the world. So sometimes you have that charter power of what you can do directly. Second is kind of your coercive power. What can you kind of not threaten, but say this is necessary for us to do, and there's consequences if we don't do this, to your national leaders or to others that are around you. Your third C is your convening power. And I think this is probably the most misunderstood or underappreciated, I should say, not misunderstood, where people don't realize just by convening and leading with some humility alongside strength, that you are much more powerful. No mayor, she or he is always limited. In certain cities, it's a weak mayor system. There's a city council you have to share with. You usually are one island in a larger metropolitan area. So here in Los Angeles, for instance, I convene the 87 other mayors, and yes, you heard that right, there's 87 other cities just in LA County as the biggest city, and it gives them kind of the deference and the connection to use me at the national level to open doors, but also to listen to their needs and try to act together. So I think the same thing happens at the national level. We've had a very hostile, I've had the experience 3 times. The Obama administration, we worked extremely closely. I mean, we were giving ideas. It was a two-way street. National policies were formed sometimes from the experience of what we were doing here locally, and then vice versa. Then we had the Trump administration, where it was like open warfare, where he was saying every single day that cities were our problems, as if they were some other entity, not part of the country that he was charged with governing, where we would have to greet folks at the airport when the Muslim ban came out, and to model that again of the asylum seeker who was coming from Iran, who I was able to embrace at the airport in front of cameras to show this is the face of our city, and this is the face of belonging, and this is the face of America, and still keep open, working with the Trump administration on other global things, because you can't completely shut that down, no matter how different their values are from yours. And now with the Biden administration, where I think there really is a desire to help at that local level. Here's one tip I would say, one last thing on this, is that when national leaders, be nice to them, because national leaders will come to you at some point and need you as the example of what their national policies are doing. For instance, our infrastructure package just got passed. Now they're like, we want to make sure this stuff gets spent. And so I say, okay, here's the list. I got it. We've got 15 rail lines. We've got the Olympics coming. We've got DWP converting, our water to be all recycled so we can deal with the drought. I've got the list ready to go. And I think that's the way to engage, is to offer them solutions to problems that they're confronting. And that does actually transcend partisanship, as much as we don't think it does. The Trump administration came to us seeking those sorts of moments, and that helped even as we were yelling at each other about other policies.
We've got a great last question here. It's something that you've worked on. This is from Quentin Wilson. How have members of the community beyond leaders in government and nonprofit organizations been involved in LA's Sustainable Development Goals effort?
Quentin, we are kind of the laboratory mice, as it were. This is an area that a lot of American cities haven't worked in. And so we're kind of figuring that out together, but I'll tell you a couple of bright spots of where we're beginning to see this. We're seeing this among students who are becoming educated and kind of being the constituency for the SDGs, to push my successors to make sure that momentum continues, and to look at issue areas where they have particular concerns, whether it's sustainability or housing or gender equity, whatever it would be, and to push that forward. We've worked closely with Occidental College and a sea of interns. So I think the academic level is absolutely critical, because SDGs are tough to count. They're tough to count at the national level. Most cities don't have that capacity at the local level at all. We're the second biggest city in America, so we could cobble together with great partners, but there's no city that couldn't do it without the help, I think, of local academic institutions. So I think that's really critical as well. I think in the average citizen space, I wish I could say 99 out of 100. It's probably 999 out of 1,000. Angelinos would go, huh? What's an SDG? But part of that, I think, then really gets to the heart of educating ourselves, working through our school districts and others to seed the ground of young people that are coming up to understand what this is, and then to work with, you said nonprofit organizations already, but really those community groups that could embrace this. And we've seen some of our neighborhood councils, which are very locally elected officials, nearly 100 something strong of those in each neighborhood, begin to kind of flirt with the SDGs, get involved, and maybe around some of them, like sustainability, they already are talking to each other across neighborhoods without needing City Hall to hold their hand. So I think that's a good model too, where that exists at the village level and the neighborhood level as well. But I guess since it's the last question, I'll say this too. Our ability to make sure that our global work at the local level has staying power relies on not just enlightened administrations and leaders. It's going to really rely on making the case to all Americans, wherever they live, that this is in their interests and this is necessary for the goals that they want to achieve in addressing the challenges in their own lives, whether they're economic or social challenges, whether they're environmental. We have to figure out ways that people can co-own. And I think Americans do in many places, but in the heart of America, we see globalism touching us. We have to figure out a way for vice versa to be true, where we can be not just passive bystanders, not just cheerleaders or critics, but co-authors of this new global moment from a local perspective. We all have that power, we just don't realize it. But when we do, I think America's rebirth on the global stage will be something to contend with.
That is a great note to close this discussion on. We are a little bit past 3 p.m., so thank you for being generous with your time. Terrific questions, and thank you for sharing your experience with us. This has been a special opportunity for us at the Elliott School. Thanks to all of you for joining. This is set up as a webinar, so you can't see everybody's face and wave, but just terrific expertise in the questions that we had, as I'm sure you can hear. So thank you very much. I hope you have a great afternoon, and we will edit this and post it online in the coming days.
Great. Thanks so much, Dean. Great to see you. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Great to see you too. Bye.